You've walked into a room and known something was wrong before a single word was spoken. You thought something was going to happen, and it did, and you had no logical reason to think so. And every time that happened, you probably filed it under coincidence. You moved on, and you forgot it. What if none of those moments were coincidences? What if they were your perception system doing exactly what it was designed to do? My story is, I was 33 when I started looking into psychic ability. And I had these experiences that made me go, oh my gosh, I think this might be real. I don't know quite yet. I'm not feeling it's changing my understanding of reality or how I move through this world. But what if it's true? I had these little things that felt more than a coincidence. There comes a point when you come across the information that makes you recognize you are psychic. This is a part of who you are. It's a part of your toolkit. Knowing what I know now, I can look back to the first time I had a psychic, like legit psychic experience, and I was 12 years old, and it was a dream. I look back at that time, and I'm really surprised that I didn't go further into understanding psychic ability because I had a dream. I wrote it down in my dream journal because I was doing that at that time. And then 2 days later, the dream happened in front of me. It was something that I didn't understand at that time. And I felt like at that time, it was something that had just occurred. It wasn't something that I was in control of. But I think back to that time that I had that dream to think that that was the very first example of being psychic, and that I went from 12 years old to 33, not really looking more into my psychic ability. But because I grew up in the society that maybe you grew up in, psychic wasn't talked about. It wasn't normalized. It wasn't like, who was around to tell me your psychic dream is evidence of your psychic ability? It wasn't just a rando weird thing. It was something that legitimately is about a skill set that you have and that is available to everybody. Nobody's around to say that. And so I went 21 years not even investigating it. I can think back to that moment being like my first evidence of psychic ability and knowing like at that age I could have started training. But I mean, nobody was around to tell me. Nobody was there. That's one of the reasons why I do this podcast, because I can say there were 20 years where I was capable of doing psychic stuff and I had no idea and I didn't consider it for me. And that's why I want you to consider it for you, because I've been there and I know what it feels like. Now I know what it feels like on the other side of it. My name is Sarah Nickerson, and welcome to Sovereign Humankind, Evolving Inner Authority Through Metaphysical Skill. I'm a psychic medium and founder of nextgenmedium.com and the NextGen Sovereign Online Metaphysical Abilities Education Center and Community, which is focused on developing human bioperceptual technology, which is intuition, psychic ability, and purpose-led living. Today, we're opening phase 2 of the series, and we're starting with psychic perception. The misconception with psychic ability is that it is a rare gift that belongs to a select few people who have always known they had it. But I'm here to say the truth is that psychic ability is quite possibly a trainable skill, and it starts with attention and reception. And you have already been using it, and you maybe haven't known what that actually is, what that experience actually feels like, or maybe what to call things. So today we are covering what psychic perception actually is, why most of us were never offered it as a real possibility, and what reclaiming it actually looks like. And by the end of this episode, you'll have a completely different relationship with every unexplained moment of knowing you have ever had. If you like what you hear, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/nextgenmedium. First, let's talk about where we came from, which was phase 1. And what phase 1 was meant to set up was to build a foundation to work off of for you to entertain the concept that metaphysical abilities are something you have. And the things that you already have familiarity of, the word metaphysical, how perception works, biology, conditioning, putting all these things on the table, we're looking at these things going, this is what you're familiar with. This is how it works for metaphysical abilities. And consider that what you know is something that actually bridges you to a metaphysical self with metaphysical skills. And it wasn't about blowing your mind with some weirdo metaphysical stuff, because honestly, I can talk about these things and talk about it in a way that feels detached from your understanding of reality. And my whole thing, the whole time I've been doing what I've been doing, is to have things be very grounded in a sense of logic and reality, because that's how I understand the world. And honestly, that's why I think I went 20 years having had psychic experiences and not being able to see them for what they were, because I was so grounded in logic. And that's how I understood the world, science-based. I want to see the evidence, But that phase 1 was just building a foundation of understanding so we can get on the same page with, like, we're logical people, but there might be something for you to consider here. And that's what phase 2 is about. It's really getting into the meat of the human capacities, the bioperceptual tools. So this episode and the 2 that are coming after this, these are about the 3 modes, the 3 systems, what they are and how they work. And then episodes 10, 11, 12 are going to answer how you work with them. We get real specific with things. And also, in the end, what life looks like when all of these skills are on board. What does sovereign humankind, like, what is that? And this next phase is really going to be the pivot point of where you go, where am I versus where am I going? And that's what phase 2 is really starting to peel back and for us all to be on the same page with. The thread running through all of it is the same kind of argument made 3 different ways. These systems are already running for you. The work is not learning something foreign. It's actually just gaining an awareness of something that's already there and already being used. And then the third thing is it's learning to recognize and trust the skills and the tools that are there. And it doesn't require belief, because you can see the evidence of it, because I will tell you how that works. Not because you should believe everything I say, but because you should consider it and go test it and explore it for yourself. Okay? I'm the messenger. I had an experience that changed how I experienced this world. And so my job is to tell you that's a possibility, to share with you how I think it works, and to help bridge you into that reality for yourself. I can't do the bridging. I'm just the messenger. I'm the mouthpiece. You're the one that has to do the work and have the experience in order for that to become a reality. When it comes to what we start with, when it comes to understanding psychic ability, most of us know the concept of psychic from TV. At least growing up, that's how I knew psychic. When I was becoming an adult, there was the Long Island Medium, there was Hollywood Medium, which were reality shows. I think culturally, we also understand psychic ability. So I'm saying mediums. These are people that talk to dead people. But I just want to be sure that you are aware that I'm using the word mediumship because culturally, we kind of link mediumship and psychic together. Now, there is a difference between psychic and medium, so let me explain that just for a second. Mediumship is talking to dead people, and then psychic is you're experiencing something that is your firsthand perceptive account. So it could be something from the past. It could be something that's happening now. It could be something that's happening or is going to happen in the future. And it can happen in another part of the world. And it's almost like you can transcend space and time with that. And of course, culturally, we get exposed to like psychic hotlines or psychic guests that go on to talk shows or whatever. This was more popular in the 90s, right? The 2000s, 90s. But of course, you are also going to think about crystal balls. You're going to think about tarot cards. And you're also going to think about a person when you hear the word psychic. It is a term that is a noun. And one of my big things was it's not a noun. It's something that you do. It's not a person. A person who rides a bike is not a bike rider. They're just a person who rides a bike. And it's the same thing with psychic stuff. Like, it's just a person using psychic skill. And so that's how we culturally know psychic, is both these things we've seen on TV, but also even the terminology, just the word. It's not a person. It's a skill. And so there are just all of these little things that add up to misunderstanding what psychic is because of what we're culturally exposed to, what stories sort of continued with it, and also how it just didn't make sense to begin with. And so the cultural picture gets pretty consistent in that psychic ability belongs to a specific kind of person and that they were born with it and they've always had it and it sets them apart. And I will say that that explanation is also part of why I wouldn't consider it for myself when I was 12 years old, because it wasn't a typical thing that I had experienced. And people who, well, at least what I thought at that time, people who were psychic knew they were psychic because they grew up that way. But there's also some cultural context that go further and frame it as something fearful and something evil. And that right there freaks people out about it. I think a lot of people, when it comes to psychic ability and even the prospect of like practicing, there's a fearfulness to it in that, you know, evil entities are going to attach themselves to you or evil spirits. That's not the stuff that I subscribe to or that is part of my reality and understanding of this stuff. So when it comes to psychic, this is the map most of us are working from, and it's almost entirely wrong. And so the reframe that is like most important to me is that you understand that psychic ability is not a person, that it is a perceptual skill, and it's not selective, that there is something strong in our psychic ability for each of us, and that it can be a tool that we utilize where we can start to see a firsthand account of truth if we want to. There is, I believe, a universal sense of the psychic ability, and that we all have a strong way of using it, that we can come to rely on it and really understand our reality in its fuller form that we really don't get to explore. So let's define psychic ability here. Psychic ability is the capacity to receive pieces of information that cannot be explained by prior learning, memory, or direct physical sensory input. It transcends space and time, and that's pretty much it. So think of psychic ability like transmission and reception, like a system that transmits and receives. Something is being transmitted, and you are the receiver. The mechanics of that transmission are still like, I can give you my theory about it, but it really doesn't matter. Theory does not matter. What matters is your job in being a receiver, because that's what builds the experience, and that is documentable. It is repeatable. It is a way to gain evidence, and it's something you can hone in on and really train. So in the way this skill is taught and practiced, the primary location of attention that I always draw people to, and then I kind of generalize at first, is that with psychic ability, it's all in the head. It's all in the head, in the imagination space. When it comes to information gained from the body, I tend to generalize that, especially when we're just beginning to understand these things. I generally will place that as the intuitive tool, whereas the psychic tool is more of the imagination space and your brain. It actually reminds me of working with a medium, John Holland. He came up to Maine to do a workshop, and he did it with Janet Nohovic, another medium who's passed. One of the tips I remember him giving in the workshop was the idea of when you are looking to connect, you really are focusing on sort of this invisible antenna that's coming off of your head. And when you are looking to connect, it's sort of like imagining there's a little spot that's 6 inches above your head. And that is where you're focusing when it comes to receiving the information and seeing what comes through. And so even his example of, an exercise to do to get to that reception space, again, has us going to the head. And in that instance, even beyond the body. And there, of course, there's plenty of spiritual stuff you can look at that has locations above the body that are important in the energetic stuff of a human. But when I'm helping people train their psychic ability, we are focusing mostly on the imagination space and your brain. And when it comes to receiving information through the body, this is where I say, oh, well, nothing's 100%. You always got to be 99. You can't be 100% with anything, because you will receive artifact information, that's psychic information, through your body. And that's where what I just said doesn't make sense, but I have to be really generalized in order for you to build an understanding and then to work off of that in order to build your experiences, which will say, you know what, for the most part, Sarah's right about that, but from my experiences, there is stuff that happens to my body that becomes psychic messaging. And that's when I can say, see, that's that little caveat, or that 1%. So I like to generalize when we first are beginning to understand these things. But we'll talk more about the intuition piece in the next episode. So psychic's more cerebral, and the imagination space is really the training ground that we are utilizing. And so what you're receiving in the imagination space when you're focusing on the cerebral space, we are utilizing what's called metasenses, psychic senses, or the clairs. 3 terms, and there's more terms, but they all mean the same thing. And we're talking about the senses that you utilize for your psychic experience. And so 3 that I typically talk about and I start people off with is clairvoyance. Clairvoyance means clear seeing. Clair is French, and it means clear. And it's going to be in all these words because it's part of the clairs. And that's the term I'll use, is the clairs, because a lot of people are familiar with that if they've done psychic training before. So, and if you've come across psychic training before, they probably said things utilizing clair terms. And one other reason why I use clair terms is because there is an abundance of clair terms that specify perceptive experiences that our physical senses, the terminology for our physical senses, are limited to. Let me explain that. I like to think of our clairs as there's a physical version of it, and then there's the internal mental version of it. So I can physically see with my eyes, all right? And we use the terminology, vision, visual. I can picture it because my eyeballs are the mechanisms that are taking in the information, and it's being processed in my brain. And then it becomes information that I use in order to do whatever I got to do. Now, there is a clair version of that. That would be a mental sense where it sort of bypasses the physical sense of vision, of using my eyeballs. And it's almost like an impression is given to the processing part of my brain. And that's where clairvoyance comes into play. That with clairvoyance, we get visuals, we get images, scenes. I've even sort of had like moving picture symbols, flashes. Sometimes I visually see words. Another example is clairaudience. So the physical world tool for clairaudience would be hearing with my ears. And so I hear sound, comes in through my ears, I process it. And in psychic terms, we would use clairaudience, in which my physical tools are not being utilized, but the brain processing is what is given the impression. And then from there, I utilize that information as artifact and then have to cross-reference it in order for it to become evidence. So clairaudience would be another term that I would share with people when they're first starting out, because it's pretty awesome to have a word to use when you are experimenting and you are getting used to a whole new sense of reality. Clairaudience is hearing words, hearing phrases, hearing sounds, hearing voices. This one, I was convinced that I had no clairaudience for a very long time until one episode of Jeopardy, and I heard bells. I heard ringing of bells, and it had to do with the answer. And then I was like, oh, well, clairaudience, check. I got it. And then the last one is claircognizance. This doesn't have a physical sensing equivalent. And there's actually a lot of things like this with your psychic senses, with your psychic experiences. You almost won't have a physical world equivalent. But the more you practice and the more you experience, the more you'll get the sense that there are other perceptions that you can identify. And another example, so real quick, claircognizance is just knowing. Just knowing. You know a thing. I also have a theory that claircognizance is information that's received so fast that you almost can't tell how you got it. You almost can't tell. So many different things I've had experiences with in a psychic sense that I think there's a physical equivalent to it. We're just not there in understanding it yet. We're still learning about the different ways we perceive with our body. And it just goes to show like how much more we have scientifically to uncover about ourselves to really understand just our body piece and not even the brain stuff, which is what I feel like the psychic stuff is really focused on, is what's going on in our brain and our amygdala. But anyway, so the clairs, these are how we perceive our psychic artifacts, the things that come through. And when we are documenting, these are the terms that are helping us get to know this world, having words to describe it, having senses to explore that you haven't had the attention or the experience of utilizing in your physical world body. So all of these examples are clairsenses, and there's more. It's perception of information through channels other than the standard 5 physical senses. And they're the senses you utilize for your psychic experiences. When it comes to psychic perception, something that's very fundamental to the experience and how we can define it is that psychic perception is challenging what you know of location in space and your position in time. There are terms that we can utilize to specify our intention with our psychic ability. For instance, if I want to stay in this place in time, but I want to see in my mind's eye what's going on the other side of the world. Like I'm a bird flying in the air. I want to see what's going on. I want to look down on the ground and I want to investigate. That is called remote viewing. So that is a psychic experience. It's perceiving a location elsewhere, somewhere else in the world, in real time, the time that is happening right now. This is where I get to share that the U.S. government ran a remote viewing program for nearly 30 years. They wrote a manual on how to train somebody to remote view. Remote viewing is psychic. The government was teaching people how to use their psychic abilities. It's not fringe. It's a part of our U.S. history. And it's crazy to think that this is Googleable. And I have it on my website. I've had it there for years on my blog. And because I came across it myself. And I was like, what is this? And I read through it and I was like, these are instructions on how to tune people into their psychic ability. Other psychic terms would be retrocognition. So this is focused on a time previous to this present moment. So we're going back in time with retrocognition. This can also incorporate a different place as well. And precognition is when something happens in the future and you're getting information about a future event. So this is, again, transcending time. And in this circumstance, precognition is forward in time, perceiving future events. I tend to think of all of these capabilities, remote viewing, retrocognition, precognition. All of these are observational, passive psychic experiences. We're just looking. We're just seeing what's going on. But there are psychic experiences that aren't passive, where you are doing things that are affecting things. And that's when we talk more about stuff like healing and manifestation and stuff like that. So I want to make it clear that this work has psychic stuff in it, that we are focused on observing and a passive experience. There is some work where we are looking to change and transmute within us. The only stuff that gets changed is when we're doing higher self stuff. And so the shift to consider is that the cultural belief is that your 5 physical senses are the totality of your perceptual range. We're already seeing science challenge that, so that's great. And the reframe that we're going to go even further with and maybe get a little crazy with is that there are additional channels of information reception that most people never develop because they weren't told there's other channels. They might not even be open to that possibility. And it's not outside of the human experience. It is something that is very much a part of your human experience, and why I title this podcast and the work that I do as human abilities. We didn't have a name for it. We didn't have the possibility of it. It wasn't maybe a part of our reality. And now it is. So why were we never given this possibility? For most people, it was never presented as reality for you. And for some people, it was conceptualized as something scary and fearful and maybe evil. So some people grew up around the idea that psychic existed, but it wasn't a part of their experience. And that was me. I knew it was a thing. I was mystified by it and attracted to it, but I didn't grow up in an environment that explored it or that knew it as their reality. But for most people, they simply grew up in a world where it was never a concept that applied to their ordinary life. And then the moments happened anyway, and the notions and the precognitions and everything occurred, but there wasn't a framework for it. And it was easy to dismiss it and to file it away as a certain term called coincidences. It was a strange, unexplainable thing. And we were maybe okay to continue on without exploring that more. And conditioning absolutely plays a role here. And we're trained from early on that real information comes from verifiable external sources. And when it comes to internal perception, things you just know without being able to point to why, those things are easy to dismiss, especially when you're conditioned to not have truth. Like truth doesn't come from you because we're conditioned to outsource truth. So even when psychic information came through, the conditioning said that doesn't count, and you just discard it and move on. And something subtle that I like to bring up about intuition and psychic and all that stuff has to do with the language that we use. And so when it comes to psychic, again, we're very cerebral with psychic. I like to define it as a cerebral experience. And I definitely feel like being somebody who felt that my body was something fearful, what it had to say were things that confused me and tortured me sometimes. I tended to have my experience in a very heady kind of way where I became just super intellectual, and that's the world I lived in. And I think that's why psychic ability was something that was very prominent for me to recognize and realize, because it is a cerebral experience. So with that being said, the language of psychic experience sounds more like, I thought that was going to happen. I perceived that. I witnessed that. I saw it in my mind's eye. And there are examples of that throughout my time before exploring psychic ability. And I think it's important to have that distinction, because that might be stuff that comes out of your mouth that you might not know what that is indicating. And when we're talking about intuition, that is more of stuff like I felt, or I had a feeling. I think that's a great term that when I hear that come out of my mouth, I go, that's intuition. But these little distinctions can help us kind of suss out what is going on when it comes to which tools being used. And with that, we gain trust in the tools because we can start to discern what is what. So this is where we think about what was a thought you had that made you think for a second, was that psychic? Whoa, that's crazy. What a coincidence. Or was this a little bit more than a coincidence? There were plenty of moments that I had where I knew it was beyond coincidence and I was not scared of it. And it had me wondering, and it stuck with me. Like they became little memory bank things for me to kind of carry with me until I finally investigated. And so I would ask you, like, what were those moments for you? A couple of them were dreams for me. I'm thinking of another circumstance where I was playing a game with my kid and it was headbands, and the card that was on my head, I suddenly had a flash of a visual of as we were playing the game. And my first guess was a tree, which is exactly what was on my head. Now, it wasn't the same tree that flashed through my mind, but it got me to say the word. And even when I was in the throes of learning psychic ability, there was an exercise we did where there was a picture in an envelope, in a sealed envelope, and we did a meditation on the picture. And in my meditation, I picked up on a bird. We opened up the envelope. The photograph was a bird, but it wasn't the same bird. In fact, there were oppositions of what kind of bird it was and the environment it was in versus the bird that was on the photograph. So it was easy for me to be like, it's not the same bird and it doesn't count. But the fact of the matter is it's a bird, and that's the psychic information I got. And some people would be impressed with that. I was not. I was actually kind of pissed off that I had a completely different perception of the photograph, even in the throes of doing the psychic stuff. You still have those moments where you go, oh, that's a coincidence. The first step in really being able to own your psychic ability, while meditation will definitely be a part of practicing being in that cerebral space, in the imagination space, it's actually much simpler. And it really comes down to where you're placing your attention, because we need to learn to kind of rein it back. And so for most of us, we move through our day in a like sort of low grade hypnotic state. And we're not choosing where our attention goes. We're just used to it being drawn away from us. And so our first step is really just flipping on the conscious awareness switch and noticing where you are in sort of a default state. And then recognizing that there is somewhere else you can be with your attention. One of the ways that we practice that is by changing our brainwave state. And we do meditation in order to draw that attention inward and start exploring the imagination, which is something that we are actively being drawn away from. And the imagination, while it can serve a couple different purposes, is where we're going to build our space that connects us with a metaphysical realm, that connects us with information that we don't know how it gets there, but it just does. And that's where we trial, and that's where we test and experiment. And so in reclaiming, in owning the psychic ability, your first step is to take your attention back, and you're choosing what to receive instead of absorbing whatever's in the environment. So a quick practical list here when it comes to re-owning the psychic ability that is there and ready for you to claim, pay attention to. First is to be open to the possibility that you could be psychic. I think that's one of the things I had going for me in this whole journey. And then our culture kind of shifted in sort of being able to see psychic or mediumship in a different way, in a way that we could witness it and observe it. And I know where I live, that kind of stuff has been available for me to go and visit and see for myself. And it sounds really simple to be open to the possibility that you could be psychic, but man, it took me a good long time to consider that for myself and to accept that for myself. Because you also have to consider, what does it mean if I'm psychic? How does that change my relationship with people? My mom, with my dad, with my significant other? What changes once that becomes your reality? It gets really heavy. It gets kind of crazy. And it's something definitely worth sitting with, because it's something that you might have to really face in your future. Another practical step is practicing meditation. We'll get more into that, and I'll give you more instruction on that kind of stuff coming up, but it's really getting your brainwave state into a certain place that is observational and has you just seeing what's going on. And actually, that's the next step, is going to your imagination with an intention of just watching what happens, which is kind of hard for us because that seems boring, but it's pretty friggin' exciting to see psychic information take place and become evidence. It's a process, but it starts there. Document everything. It's awesome to have the experiences, but if you are having the evidence, which is what documenting allows, then you are missing amazing moments where you can go back and be like, that was what I meditated about 2 weeks later. Oh my God, that person got the job that I thought they would get. Thoughts that I saw. See, these are the psychic terms. I would also look into the clairs. Now, this is something that is a part of education that I have at Next Gen Sovereign, is a nice, robust list of the clairs and how they're experienced. There is nothing like having words for your experiences, and it's amazing to see your perception expand and to have examples on hand of like what a clair sentient experience was like for you and how you have experienced it, because it'll be useful in the future when you have more of those experiences. And the realistic timeline I give for people is, it takes 66 days to learn a new behavior and for it to become like a natural thing that you do. Some people it takes longer to do that. Some people it might be shorter, and some people it just might just be a difficult thing to do. But you got to think that your consistency in doing these things really is building the neural pathways for this stuff to be accessible when you intend to do it. So with time, you doing the meditations and building that neural pathway to the psychic information turns into 2 years later, you standing in the grocery line and you're getting psychic information about the person that's standing in front of you, and you're fully awake and fully aware, and you're not even in a deep meditative state. It's just surfacing because that's a part of the pathways that your brain is used to accessing. And in that kind of circumstance, like, you would be primed to start doing readings. And I mean, you probably should do readings before that, but like getting paid to do readings or being able to share the information you're getting with other people. So it could take several months for you to get to a point where you're feeling a flow with it. And for me, it took about 8-9 months before I had the information that made me go, this stuff's real. And then you really got to think about like, what's my end goal with this stuff, And that's why I want to introduce the sovereign self understanding, because there is sort of this weird thing about your reality where it's like, oh my God, I have a superpower, like I got to use this to help people understand things. Like they need to come to me for Metso. So you got to like figure out, am I going to do psychic readings? What am I going to do with this? And with the sovereign self trifecta, there's a next step, and it's understanding the intuition. You can understand intuition in a very intellectual way, and you can observe it, but there is a time when you have to integrate your body into things. And then you start understanding that your psychic and your intuition are actually occurring together. They're both giving me information here. So one thing about the psychic experience that I talk about is the information you get is called artifacts. So this is the stuff that's observed. I did a meditation where I was talking with my husband's grandfather who had passed a couple years before the meditation. And I got artifacts that were visual, where I was looking at his hand in his pant pocket. I was seeing a visualization of a coin. I was seeing the color of the coin. I was seeing the size of the coin. I could even sort of have a relative understanding that it was a bigger than usual coin. And so these are all artifacts. How I'm getting it is clairvoyance, but also what's the information? It's the coin. It's a foreign coin. That's claircognizance. I knew that it was foreign. And so all of these are artifacts. Just like if you were to go on a dig, an archaeological dig, you're getting pieces of pottery, you're getting bone, it's all artifacts until you can piece it all together as to fact. And that's where you have to cross-reference and get the artifact become evidence. That's validated factual information. So after that meditation, my husband's grandfather, I went to my mother-in-law and I asked her about this information. So he's got his hand in his pocket. He's got a big coin. It's a foreign coin. It's this color, blah, blah, blah. She was able to confirm and validate that artifact. They all became evidence. And so that's exactly how it works. And sometimes you won't cross that boundary with your artifacts. And that's okay. So each of the three capacities link to a pillar of the sovereign self. There's truth, there's trust, there's choice. And psychic perception links to truth. Not truth as ideology, not truth as what you were told. Truth as something you experience directly, something that passes your own inspection. And so when psychic ability develops, you train it. The quality of truth changes. It stops being a logical conclusion and starts being a knowing. That comes with embodiment. That takes a lot of time and an understanding of truth in your capabilities. And there's a term for this knowing of truth. It's called noetic. It's a truth that has a physiological sense to it, not just an intellectual understanding. And this is not a beginner experience. For me, it developed later after the skill had been built and integrated. Once I had an understanding of psychic and intuition. And I would say even into recent years, I've really grown a depth in my noetic sense, a sense that it's almost like it bypasses the emotional filter and the logical filter, and it goes right to my core of this is truth. And it happens so fast. Sometimes I don't notice it. And I can continue on with my day and my flow, and it directs me. And I feel like it integrates psychic and intuition. It's an integration of both of these skills, and it's because of the time and trust that I have with these two skills that I think it's become its own entity of sovereign self-living. That's taken quite a bit of time to get to. It's a truth that has a physiological sense to it, not just an intellectual understanding, but it's worth naming here so that you know what's going on down the road here is noetic. This is I feel it. I feel the truth. And something else happens with integrating your psychic ability. After you recognize its truth and you sort of have this new identity that shapes for yourself or new understanding of the reality that you are involved in that just became super expanded. you begin realizing things that you once held as truth, and you start realizing like there isn't a lot of truth there. When your own perception becomes the reliable source, the things you accepted on someone else's authority, they feel less solid. And so you realize your truth is built from what passes through your own direct experience. And if there's information you want to get, you know how to get it. And then the next question is, how bad do you really want that information? And how much does that really change things once you have it? And that there is only so much any human being can really know with certainty. That acceptance is part of sovereignty. Truth actually becomes less important, but the truth that you do have becomes much heavier. So every time you had a notion that turned out to be right, maybe that wasn't coincidence. That was maybe your perception system doing something it's been capable of doing for a very long time. You just weren't trained to use it. You weren't trained to understand that that's what was going on, and no one ever told you to pay attention to it. But here's the part that matters. You have the skill right now. This series, this podcast is training you on what is dormant for you and how to activate, how to get it on board. So everything changes from here. And like I said, you don't need to believe anything I say, but you got to at least try. So you can start right now by looking back at the things that you've sloughed off as coincidence, but have held on to because there was just something about that experience that felt like there was something beyond, and it could be a psychic moment, right? So sit with that. Think about that, because you bringing your attention and your curiosity to these things is perpetuating the story of the uncovering of these things for yourself. So when I was 33 years old and finally pursuing what had always been there for me, it's amazing now that I can look back on all these experiences I had that were psychic. I just didn't really know there was more that I could do with it. My intention could change the practice. All these things could change my reality. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side. And I went to that class that day not even thinking like my whole world's going to change. I was actually pissed that I had to put pants on, but I did it. And I went and I left that day, and my world has never been the same. That does it for this episode of Sovereign Humankind, Evolving Inner Authority Through Metaphysical Skill. Next episode, we'll get into intuition as directional intelligence, and you'll start to see where the line between these two systems falls. Don't believe everything I told you. That is not the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is to give you something to do, is to explore, is to test and see what becomes possible. And if what you heard today has your curiosity moving, it is worth following. The Next Gen Sovereign Foundation's community at nextgenmedium.com is where the practice begins. Guided exercises, meditation, experiences, documentation frameworks, and a community doing this work alongside of you. Come find us there. And if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/nextgenmedium. You can also visit my website, nextgenmedium.com. Check out the page for this podcast, and I got a link there to buy me a coffee. This is Sarah Nickerson of nextgenmedium.com and the Next Gen Sovereign Community. Be well, take care, and get to observing. See you next time.